The fluorescent lights of the jewelry store buzzed overhead as I stood frozen, watching the appraiser's face change from professional politeness to something I'd never seen before. Pure shock. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His hands trembled slightly as he set down his magnifying glass and looked up at me, then back down at the simple silver band I'd worn every day for the past 3 years. The same ring my sister-in-law Jessica had called pathetic just hours earlier at my own anniversary dinner. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "where exactly did you get this ring?" I could still hear Jessica's laughter echoing in my mind, the way she'd grabbed my hand in front of the entire restaurant and announced to everyone that my husband clearly didn't love me enough to buy me real jewelry. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this ring held secrets that would change everything. Secrets that would make her eat every cruel word she'd ever spoken about me. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in our small apartment in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I was Maria Gonzalez, 28 years old, working as a librarian at the local community college while my husband David finished his engineering degree. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. Our furniture came from thrift stores, our car had over 200,000 miles on it, and our idea of a fancy dinner was ordering pizza with extra toppings. But we were happy. At least, I thought we were. I'd been up since 5:30, preparing for what was supposed to be a celebration. 3 years ago today, David had proposed to me in the same community garden where we'd had our first date. It wasn't the proposal of fairy tales. There was no bended knee, no crowd of onlookers, no professional photographer hiding behind the rose bushes. Just David, nervous and stuttering, pulling a simple silver ring from his jacket pocket while we sat on the old wooden bench by the tomato plants. "It was my grandmother's," he'd said, his hands shaking as he slipped it onto my finger. "She always said it would find its way to the right person someday." The ring was beautiful in its simplicity. A thin silver band with an intricate pattern of vines and tiny flowers etched around the circumference. No diamonds, no precious stones, just delicate craftsmanship that caught the light in unexpected ways. When I wore it, I felt connected to something larger than myself, though I couldn't quite explain what. David's grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, had passed away just months before we met. From what David told me, she'd been an extraordinary woman who'd immigrated to the United States from Spain in the 1940s with nothing but a suitcase and an iron will. She'd worked as a seamstress, cleaning houses by day and sewing wedding dresses by night until she'd saved enough to buy a small shop downtown. Elena had raised David's father as a single mother after her husband died in a factory accident, and when David's parents died in a car crash when he was 15, she'd taken him in without hesitation. She always said this ring was special, David had told me on our wedding day, watching as I adjusted it on my finger for the 100th time. But she never told me why, just that it had been in our family for generations, and that someday it would reveal its secrets to the right person. I'd assumed it was just the romantic ramblings of an elderly woman who wanted her jewelry to feel meaningful. After all, every family had stories about heirloom pieces that were supposedly more valuable or significant than they appeared. But wearing Elena's ring made me feel grounded, connected to a history I'd never known but somehow belonged to. The problem started when David's brother Marcus got engaged to Jessica Chen 6 months ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Jessica was everything I wasn't. She worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative, drove a brand new BMW, and wore designer clothes that cost more than my monthly salary. Her engagement ring was a 2-carat diamond solitaire that she made sure everyone noticed, holding her hand just so whenever she spoke, angling it toward the light for maximum sparkle. From the moment Marcus introduced her to the family, Jessica made it clear that she thought David had married beneath him. She never said it directly, of course. Instead, she offered to take me shopping for more appropriate clothes, suggested I consider a different hairstyle that might be more flattering, and constantly mentioned job opportunities that might help David and me get ahead in life. The comments about my ring started small, little observations about how vintage jewelry was so interesting. or how she admired people who weren't caught up in material things. But as their wedding approached, and Jessica became more entrenched in the family, her comments grew sharper. She'd make jokes about David's sentimental side when she saw my ring, or wonder aloud whether I'd ever want to upgrade to something more modern. I tried to ignore it. Jessica was going to be family, and I wanted to keep the peace. David noticed the tension but brushed it off as wedding stress. "She's just nervous about the wedding," he'd say whenever I mentioned feeling unwelcome. "Once everything settles down, she'll relax." But Jessica didn't relax. If anything, she became bolder. She started making comments in front of other family members, comparing her engagement ring to mine and wondering why David hadn't invested more in our relationship. She'd grab my hand to examine my ring more closely, always with that sympathetic smile that made my stomach turn. "It's just so simple," she'd say, turning my hand this way and that. "I mean, I suppose there's something to be said for understated elegance. But don't you ever want something that really sparkles?" The worst part was how the rest of the family began to treat me differently. David's aunts, who had always been warm and welcoming, started making subtle comments about finances and stability. His cousins, who used to include me in their conversations, began talking around me instead of to me. I felt like I was disappearing, becoming invisible in my own marriage, while Jessica's presence grew larger and more dominating with each family gathering. 3 weeks ago, Jessica had suggested that we all celebrate David and my 3rd anniversary together, since it fell just 2 weeks before her wedding. "It'll be like a practice run for all the fancy dinners we'll have once Marcus and I are married," she'd said, with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Plus, it'll give Maria a chance to dress up for once." David thought it was a wonderful idea. He'd been working so hard on his final semester that we hadn't had a proper date night in months. The idea of celebrating our anniversary with family felt special to him, a way of honoring both our marriage and the new addition to the family. I agreed because I wanted to believe that Jessica was trying to build a bridge between us, that maybe she genuinely wanted to get to know me better. I should have known better. I spent the entire afternoon getting ready, trying on every dress I owned before settling on a navy blue wrap dress I'd bought for a faculty dinner last year. It was the nicest thing in my closet, and I'd paired it with small silver earrings that matched my ring and low heels that didn't hurt my feet. When David saw me, his face lit up with that same smile he'd worn on our wedding day. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing my forehead. "Grandma Elena would have loved seeing you all dressed up in her ring." We met Marcus and Jessica at Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant in the historic district that was definitely outside our usual budget. Jessica had insisted on making the reservation, claiming she had connections that could get us a good table. When we arrived, she was already there, wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my rent and jewelry that caught the restaurant's ambient lighting like a personal spotlight. "Maria!" she exclaimed, standing to hug me. "You look so sweet. That dress is perfect for you." The way she said sweet made it sound like an insult, but David didn't seem to notice. He was too busy greeting Marcus and settling into his chair, already relaxed in a way I hadn't seen him in weeks. I tried to follow his lead, to enjoy the evening and celebrate our anniversary despite the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. Dinner started pleasantly enough. We talked about David's upcoming graduation, Marcus's promotion at the bank, and Jessica's wedding plans. The food was delicious, better than anything David and I had eaten in months, and for a while I almost forgot about my reservations. Jessica seemed genuinely interested in our anniversary story, asking questions about our proposal and our first years of marriage. But then the conversation turned to the wedding, specifically to Jessica's engagement ring and wedding jewelry. She held up her hand, letting the diamond catch the candlelight as she described the process of choosing the perfect stone. "Marcus was so patient," she gushed, smiling at her fiancé. "We must have visited 8 different jewelers before we found exactly the right ring. I wanted something that would last forever, something that really represented the magnitude of our love." She turned to me then, that familiar sympathetic smile spreading across her face. "Speaking of rings, Maria, I've been meaning to ask you about yours. It's so unique. Where did David find it?" I explained about Elena, about the family history and the sentimental value. Jessica nodded along, but I could see something calculating in her expression. "That's such a sweet story," she said when I finished. "There's something so romantic about vintage jewelry, even when it's not worth very much. It's the thought that counts, right?" David's jaw tightened. "What do you mean, not worth very much?" Jessica's eyes widened innocently. "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it. I just meant that rings from that era, especially simple silver bands like that, they're usually more sentimental than valuable. Which is totally fine," she added quickly. "Not everything has to be about money." But she wasn't finished. As the evening wore on, Jessica kept returning to the topic of my ring, each comment more pointed than the last. She wondered if I'd ever had it appraised, suggested that I might want to consider updating it for our 5th anniversary, and finally, as we were waiting for dessert, she reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "Can I see it up close?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. She pulled my hand toward her, examining the ring under the table's light. "It really is pretty, in a simple way. I mean, the craftsmanship is nice for what it is. But David, honey, don't you think Maria deserves something a little more substantial? Something that really shows how much you love her?" The restaurant suddenly felt too warm, too small. Other diners at nearby tables were starting to look our way. David's face had gone red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. "The ring is perfect," he said quietly. "It belonged to my grandmother, and Maria loves it." Jessica laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Of course she says she loves it. What else is she going to say? But come on, David, look at it." She held my hand up higher, and I felt like I was on display, like my ring was evidence of my worth or lack thereof. "It's pathetic. I mean, I'm sorry, but it is. This is what you gave the woman you want to spend the rest of your life with? This little silver band that probably came from a pawn shop?" The words hit me like physical blows. Pathetic. The same word my mother had used to describe my father's attempts to save their marriage before she left us when I was 12. The word my college roommate had used to describe my scholarship wardrobe. The word I'd tried so hard to prove didn't apply to me. "Jessica." Marcus's voice held a warning, but she was beyond caring. "I'm just being honest," she continued, still holding my hand captive. "Maria deserves better than this. Any woman deserves better than this. If you really loved her, David, you'd want her to have something beautiful, something valuable, something she could be proud to show people." I finally pulled my hand free, my face burning with humiliation. The other patrons were definitely staring now, and our waiter had stopped pretending not to listen to our conversation. David looked like he wanted to disappear, and Marcus was frantically signaling for the check. But Jessica wasn't done. "I mean, honestly, Maria, aren't you embarrassed? Don't you want people to look at your ring and know that your husband values you? That you're worth investing in?" Something inside me snapped. Not into anger, which might have been more satisfying, but into a cold, crystalline clarity. Jessica had just shown me exactly who she was, in front of witnesses, in a public place where her cruelty couldn't be denied or explained away. And more importantly, she'd shown everyone else exactly who she was too. I stood up slowly, my voice steady, despite the humiliation burning in my chest. "You're right, Jessica. I should know more about this ring. Thank you for the suggestion." I turned to David, who was still staring at Jessica in shock. "I think we should go." We left the restaurant in silence, the celebration of our anniversary effectively ruined. But as we drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, I wasn't thinking about Jessica's cruelty or the public humiliation. I was thinking about Elena Rodriguez, about her stories of Spanish heritage and family secrets, about the way she'd always smiled mysteriously whenever anyone asked about the ring. Maybe it was time I found out what those secrets really were. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with Jessica's words and my own doubts. But underneath the hurt and anger, something else was growing. Curiosity. For 3 years, I'd worn Elena's ring without questioning its history beyond David's stories. What if there was more to learn? What if Elena's mysterious comments about family secrets weren't just the romantic imaginings of an elderly woman? I spent the morning researching jewelry appraisers in the area. most specialized in modern pieces or insurance evaluations. But I found one name that caught my attention. Robert Morrison, a certified gemologist and antique jewelry specialist who worked out of a small shop in the Arts District downtown. His website mentioned expertise in European jewelry from the 18th and 19th centuries, and several testimonials praised his knowledge of historical pieces. I called and made an appointment for that afternoon, claiming I had inherited a piece I wanted to learn more about. Morrison sounded genuinely interested when I described the ring as a Spanish family heirloom with possible historical significance. "Bring it in," he said. "You'd be surprised how often people discover that grandmother's old jewelry has more history than they realized." That afternoon, I stood in Morrison's small shop, surrounded by display cases filled with glittering examples of jewelry from every era imaginable. Morrison himself was exactly what I'd expected. A thin, precise man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of attention to detail that made him perfect for his profession. "Let's see what you've brought me," he said, leading me to a workbench equipped with various magnifying devices and testing equipment. I slipped the ring off my finger for the first time in months and placed it in his palm. He examined it first with the naked eye, turning it slowly in the light, then picked up a jeweler's loupe for a closer look. "Interesting," he murmured after a few minutes. "The craftsmanship is exceptional. This vine and flower pattern. I've seen similar work before, but not often." He looked up at me. "You said this came from Spain?" I nodded, repeating what David had told me about Elena's immigration and family history. Morrison listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about dates and specific details. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward a more powerful microscope. When I nodded, he placed the ring under the lens and adjusted the focus. After a moment, he went very still. "Ms. Gonzalez," he said slowly, "I need to ask you to sit down." My heart started racing. Is something wrong? Is the ring damaged? "No," he said, his voice strange. "The ring is fine, more than fine, but I need to do some additional tests and I need to make some phone calls. Would you be willing to leave this with me overnight? I promise you it will be safe, but I need to verify what I'm seeing." I hesitated. The thought of being separated from the ring, even for one night, felt wrong. It had become such a part of me that my finger felt naked without it. "What kind of tests?" I asked. Morrison removed the ring from the microscope and held it up to the light again. "There are markings here that I need to research. Maker's marks that suggest this piece might be significantly older and more valuable than you realize. If I'm right about what I'm seeing, this isn't just a family heirloom. It's a piece of history." That's when I found myself standing in the jewelry store the next day, watching Morrison's face transform as he delivered the news that would change everything. News that would make Jessica's cruel words seem not just wrong, but spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. The ring that she'd called pathetic, that she'd used as evidence of my husband's lack of love and my own lack of worth, was about to reveal secrets that would turn our entire family dynamic upside down. And I was going to make sure Jessica had a front row seat for every moment of the revelation. The drive back to Morrison's shop felt endless. I'd spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, my naked finger feeling strange and empty without the familiar weight of Elena's ring. David had noticed immediately when I came home. "Where's your ring?" he'd asked, looking genuinely concerned. It was the first time in months he'd seemed to really see me, really focus on something that mattered to me instead of his textbooks and graduation requirements. I told him about the appraisal, about Morrison's reaction, and his request to keep the ring overnight for testing. David had been skeptical at first, wondering why I suddenly cared about the ring's value after 3 years of wearing it without question. "Jessica really got to you, didn't she?" he'd said. And there was something in his voice that might have been disappointment. "I thought you were above caring about that kind of thing." That stung more than I wanted to admit. The implication that my curiosity about the ring was somehow shallow, that I was letting Jessica's materialistic values influence me. But I couldn't explain the certainty I felt that there was more to learn about Elena's ring without sounding like I was making excuses for caring about its worth. It's not about the money, I tried to explain. It's about understanding the history. Your grandmother always said it had secrets. David had shrugged, already turning back to his engineering textbooks. Grandma Elena said a lot of things. She was old, Maria. Sometimes old people romanticize family stories. But I knew it was more than that. The way Morrison had gone still when he looked through the microscope, the careful way he'd asked me to sit down, the reverence in his voice when he talked about maker's marks and historical significance. You didn't react that way to costume jewelry or sentimental trinkets. I arrived at Morrison's shop 15 minutes before it opened, pacing the sidewalk until I saw him approaching with a large coffee and a manila envelope tucked under his arm. When he saw me waiting, his step quickened. "Ms. Gonzalez," he said, unlocking the shop door, "I'm glad you're here early. We have a lot to discuss." Inside, he led me straight to his workbench, where my ring sat in a small velvet-lined box alongside several printed photographs and what looked like pages from old books or catalogs. Morrison moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent the night researching and wanted to present his findings properly. "Before I tell you what I've discovered," he said, settling into his chair across from me, "I need you to understand that this is extraordinary. In 30 years of appraising jewelry, I've never seen anything quite like this." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What did you find?" Morrison picked up one of the photographs, a close-up image of the ring's inner band that showed markings I'd never noticed before. Under magnification, what had looked like decorative scratches revealed themselves as tiny, precise symbols. "These are hallmarks," he explained, pointing to the symbols with a small tool. "Marks that indicate where and when a piece was made, and sometimes by whom. But these particular marks..." He paused, looking at me seriously. "They tell a very specific story." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing a comparison between my ring's hallmarks and similar marks from what looked like a museum catalog. The primary mark here indicates that this piece was crafted in Toledo, Spain, sometime between 1720 and 1740. But it's this secondary mark that's truly remarkable. Morrison pointed to a tiny crown-like symbol that was barely visible, even in the magnified image. "This is the mark of the Royal Spanish Court. It indicates that this piece was created specifically for the Spanish royal family or their immediate circle." I stared at the photograph, trying to process what he was telling me. "You're saying my ring was made for royalty?" "I'm saying your ring was made for someone with direct access to the Spanish royal court," Morrison corrected. "But that's not all. I spent most of last night researching the specific combination of these marks, and I found something remarkable." He opened one of the books, revealing a page filled with detailed drawings of jewelry pieces. "This is from a catalog of items in the Spanish royal collection from the early 18th century. Look at this entry." My eyes followed his finger to a drawing that made my breath catch. It was unmistakably my ring, down to the precise pattern of vines and flowers, rendered in careful detail with notes in Spanish written alongside. According to this record, Morrison continued, this ring was commissioned in 1735 as part of a set of jewelry created for Infanta Maria Teresa Rafaela, daughter of King Philip V of Spain. She was engaged to the Dauphin of France, and this ring was part of her bridal jewelry. The words seemed to echo in the small shop. Infanta, Spanish princess, bridal jewelry. I looked down at the simple silver band sitting in its velvet box, trying to reconcile Morrison's words with the ring I'd worn every day for 3 years. "But that's impossible," I said finally. "If this ring belonged to Spanish royalty, how did it end up with David's grandmother? Elena was just an immigrant who worked as a seamstress." Morrison smiled, the expression of someone who had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time finding the answer. "That's where your family history becomes particularly fascinating. What do you know about Elena Rodriguez's background before she came to America?" I repeated what David had told me about Elena immigrating in the 1940s with nothing but a suitcase, working as a seamstress and building a life from nothing. Morrison listened carefully, occasionally nodding. Elena Rodriguez, he said when I finished. The surname Rodriguez is common enough, but given the provenance of this ring, I took the liberty of doing some genealogical research last night. I hope you don't mind. He pulled out another set of papers, these covered with family trees and historical records. I found several Elena Rodriguez entries in Spanish immigration records from the 1940s, but only one that fits the timeline and circumstances you described. Elena Mercedes Rodriguez, born in Toledo in 1918, emigrated to the United States in 1943. Morrison ran his finger down one of the family trees, but what's interesting is her mother's lineage. Elena's mother was Carmen Rodriguez, née Mendoza, and the Mendoza family has a very specific historical connection to the Spanish court. He turned to another page, this one showing a more detailed family tree that stretched back several centuries. The Mendoza family were court jewelers for the Spanish royal family from the late 1600s through the early 1800s. They were responsible for creating and maintaining jewelry for the royal household, including pieces for royal weddings and ceremonial occasions. My mind raced as I tried to follow the connections Morrison was drawing. So you think Elena's family were the jewelers who made this ring? I think Elena's family were entrusted with this ring when the Spanish royal system collapsed, Morrison said carefully. The early 1800s were a tumultuous time for European royalty. Napoleon's invasion of Spain, the Peninsular War, the eventual exile of various royal family members. Many royal artifacts disappeared during this period, either hidden for safekeeping or taken by loyal servants and craftsmen who were trying to preserve them. He pointed to another entry in the genealogical records. Carmen Mendoza's great-grandfather was Miguel Mendoza, listed in court records as the chief jeweler to the royal household from 1790 to 1820. When the French invaded and the royal family fled, it's likely that valuable pieces were distributed among trusted court servants for safekeeping. The picture Morrison was painting began to make sense. You think the ring was given to Elena's family to protect it? I think the ring was given to Elena's family because they were trusted members of the royal court's inner circle, Morrison said. And I think it stayed in the family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter, until eventually Elena brought it with her to America. Morrison reached for another book, this one filled with historical photographs. What's remarkable is that this ring wasn't just any piece of royal jewelry. According to the historical records I've found, this particular ring held special significance in the Spanish royal family. He showed me a photograph from what looked like a museum exhibit featuring various pieces of Spanish royal jewelry. The vine and flower pattern you see on your ring was the personal symbol of Infanta Maria Teresa Rafaela. She was known for her love of gardens and botanical studies, unusual for a woman of her time and station. The ring was apparently designed specifically to reflect her personal interests. I stared at the photograph, seeing my ring in an entirely new context, not just as a family heirloom or even as a valuable antique, but as a piece of jewelry that had been worn by a Spanish princess, created to reflect her personality and passions. But what happened to the princess? I asked. Did she ever marry the French prince? Morrison's expression grew somber. Maria Teresa Rafaela did marry the Dauphin, who later became Louis, Dauphin of France. But she died very young, in childbirth, when she was only 20. Her death was considered a great tragedy, and many of her personal effects were returned to Spain or distributed among her closest attendants. The weight of the ring's history settled over me like a blanket. This wasn't just valuable jewelry. It was an artifact of a young woman's life, a princess who had died centuries before I was born but whose personal symbol I had been wearing every day. There's more, Morrison said quietly. I contacted a colleague of mine who specializes in Spanish royal artifacts. She's coming here this afternoon to examine the ring in person, but based on the photographs I sent her, she believes this piece could be worth. He paused, as if the number was too large to say casually. How much? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Conservative estimate? Between $800,000 and $1.2 million. But if it can be definitively authenticated as having belonged to Maria Teresa Rafaela, if we can prove the connection to the Spanish royal family beyond any doubt. Morrison met my eyes. We could be looking at a piece worth several $1 million. The number hung in the air between us, impossible to fully comprehend. Several $1 million. For the ring that Jessica had called pathetic just 2 days ago. The ring she had held up in a crowded restaurant as evidence of my husband's lack of love and my own lack of worth. "Are you certain about this?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "There's no chance you're mistaken?" Morrison gestured to the pile of research materials spread across his workbench. "The hallmarks are definitive. The historical records are clear. The craftsmanship is consistent with known pieces from the same period and workshop. And the genealogical connection to Elena's family provides a plausible explanation for how the ring ended up in your possession." He picked up my ring from its velvet box, holding it carefully in the light. "What you have here, Ms. Gonzalez, is not just a valuable antique. It's a piece of living history. An artifact that connects you directly to Spanish royalty from the 18th century." I thought about Elena Rodriguez, working as a seamstress in a small American town, cleaning houses and sewing wedding dresses while carrying this incredible secret with her. Had she known the true value of what she possessed? Had she understood that she was preserving a piece of royal history for future generations? Did Elena know? I asked. About the royal connection? Morrison considered this carefully. "Based on the family stories you've shared, I suspect she knew it was significant. The way she talked about family secrets, about the ring revealing itself to the right person. It suggests she understood there was more to its history than she was telling." "But why didn't she say anything? Why keep it secret?" "Think about it from her perspective," Morrison said gently. "She was an immigrant in the 1940s, working to build a new life in a country that wasn't always welcoming to people like her. Having a piece of Spanish royal jewelry might have raised uncomfortable questions about how she acquired it, whether she had the right to keep it." Morrison gestured to the historical records spread across his desk. During the Spanish Civil War and World War II, there was a lot of suspicion about valuable artifacts that had been removed from Europe. Elena might have felt it was safer to keep the ring's true nature secret rather than risk losing it to government seizure or having to prove her family's legitimate claim to it. The explanation made sense. Elena had been protecting not just the ring itself, but her family's right to keep it. By treating it as a simple family heirloom rather than a royal artifact, she had ensured it would stay in the family where it belonged. "So what happens now?" I asked. "What do I do with this information?" Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "That depends on what you want to happen. If you're interested in selling the ring, I can put you in touch with auction houses that specialize in royal artifacts. A piece like this would generate enormous interest among collectors and museums." The thought of selling the ring made my stomach clench. Despite everything I'd just learned, despite its incredible value, I couldn't imagine letting it go. It had been Elena's legacy to her family, and now it was mine. "Or," Morrison continued, "you might consider having it formally authenticated and documented. There are institutions that would be very interested in studying this piece, perhaps even displaying it as part of an exhibition on Spanish royal history. You could maintain ownership while allowing others to appreciate its historical significance." "And the third option?" I asked. Morrison smiled. "You could simply continue wearing it, knowing now what you know. Keep Elena's secret, honor her trust, and carry on the tradition of protecting this piece of history." As he spoke, I thought about Jessica's cruel words from 2 nights ago. Her certainty that my ring was worthless, that it proved David didn't value me, that I should be embarrassed to wear it in public. The irony was so complete it was almost funny. While she had been flaunting her 2-carat diamond as proof of her worth, I had been wearing a piece of jewelry that belonged in a museum. But more than the vindication, more than the satisfaction of knowing how wrong Jessica had been, I felt a deep connection to Elena Rodriguez and the princess who had worn this ring before me. 2 women separated by centuries and continents, but connected by this small circle of silver that had survived war, revolution, immigration, and time itself. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "It's a lot to process." Morrison nodded, understandingly. "Of course. But Ms. Gonzalez, I do need to ask you to consider security precautions. Now that we know what this ring is worth, you shouldn't be wearing it casually. A piece this valuable needs to be properly insured and protected. He handed me a business card for an insurance appraiser who specialized in high-value jewelry. Call her this afternoon, explain the situation and arrange for proper coverage. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping the ring in a safe deposit box when you're not wearing it. The practical considerations hadn't occurred to me, but Morrison was right. I couldn't continue wearing $1 million artifact to work at the library or to grocery shopping. The ring that had been my constant companion for 3 years was about to become something I could only wear on special occasions, if at all. "There's one more thing," Morrison said as I prepared to leave. "My colleague who's coming to examine the ring this afternoon, Dr. Patricia Alvarez, she's one of the foremost experts on Spanish royal artifacts. If she confirms what I believe about this piece, she'll want to document it for academic purposes. Are you comfortable with that?" I nodded, though the thought of academic attention made me nervous. What would that involve? Photographs, detailed measurements, possibly some additional testing to confirm the silver content and dating. Nothing that would damage the ring, but it would create an official record of its existence and provenance. That documentation would be valuable if you ever decide to sell or donate the piece. As I left Morrison's shop with my ring safely back on my finger, my mind spun with possibilities and implications. I thought about David, who had dismissed his grandmother's stories as romantic fantasies. About Marcus, who had always treated Elena's side of the family as poor relations. About Jessica, who had used my ring as evidence of my inferior status in the family hierarchy. None of them knew what I now knew. None of them understood that Elena Rodriguez hadn't just been a seamstress and cleaning lady who worked her way up from nothing. She had been the keeper of royal secrets, the guardian of a piece of Spanish history that was worth more than most people's houses. The question now was what to do with that knowledge. Part of me wanted to march straight to Jessica's pharmaceutical sales office and show her Morrison's research, to watch her face as she realized just how spectacularly wrong she had been. But another part of me wanted to keep Elena's secret a little longer, to save her the private knowledge before it became public. That evening, I sat at our small kitchen table with Morrison's research spread out in front of me, waiting for David to come home from his study group. The ring felt different on my finger now, heavier somehow, as if the weight of its history had become physical. When David finally walked through the door, exhausted from another long day of senior project work, I was ready to change both our lives forever. "David," I said, looking up from the genealogical charts and historical photographs, "we need to talk about your grandmother Elena." He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. The formal documents, the museum photographs, the careful way I was holding my hands. "Maria, what's going on?" I smiled, thinking of Elena Rodriguez and the secrets she had carried for decades, thinking of a young Spanish princess who had loved gardens and died too young, thinking of Jessica's cruel laughter and her certainty that my ring was worthless. "It turns out your grandmother was keeping some very big secrets," I said, "and I think it's time her great-grandson learned the truth about his family." David's reaction was everything I had hoped for, and nothing like what I expected. When I finished explaining Morrison's discoveries, when I showed him the photographs of the hallmarks and the genealogical charts connecting his family to Spanish court jewelers, he went completely silent. Not the thoughtful silence of someone processing surprising information, but the stunned silence of someone whose entire understanding of their family history had just been turned upside down. He picked up the museum photograph showing my ring's twin in the Spanish royal collection, staring at it for long minutes before setting it down carefully, as if it might disintegrate under too much handling. "This is real?" he asked finally. "You're telling me Grandma Elena was related to Spanish royalty?" I explained the distinction Morrison had made between being related to royalty and being trusted by them, how the Mendoza family had been court jewelers rather than nobles themselves. But even that connection seemed impossible for David to fully grasp. "She cleaned houses," he said, shaking his head. "She worked 16-hour days sewing wedding dresses for other people. How could she have been hiding something like this?" That's when I understood that David's shock wasn't just about the ring's value or even its royal connections. He was grappling with a fundamental shift in how he understood his own identity. Elena hadn't just been a poor immigrant who built a better life through hard work. She had been the guardian of centuries-old secrets, carrying the responsibility of preserving royal artifacts while scrubbing other people's floors. Maybe that's exactly why she was the right person to protect it, I suggested. She understood the value of hard work, the importance of keeping precious things safe. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his most stressful exam periods. Maria, do you understand what this means? If that ring is really worth what the appraiser says, we could pay off your student loans, I said quietly. Buy a house. Never worry about money again. But even as I said it, I knew I wasn't ready to sell the ring. Not yet. There was something else I needed to do first, something that had been growing in my mind since Morrison first explained the ring's history. Over the next week, I began developing what I could only call a plan. Not a vengeful scheme, exactly, but a careful strategy for revealing the truth in a way that would have maximum impact. Jessica's wedding was in 10 days, and I had been dreading it since the anniversary dinner disaster. But now I saw it as an opportunity. I started by scheduling a formal authentication session with Dr. Patricia Alvarez, Morrison's colleague from the university. She arrived at the jewelry shop on Thursday afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in Spanish colonial and royal artifacts. Her examination of the ring was even more thorough than Morrison's, involving chemical testing, X-ray photography, and comparison with known royal pieces from museum collections. This is extraordinary, she told me after 3 hours of careful analysis. I've seen pieces from this workshop before, but never one with such clear documentation of royal ownership. The hallmarks are absolutely authentic, and the craftsmanship matches known work by Miguel Mendoza's workshop perfectly. Dr. Alvarez wanted to write an academic paper about the ring, documenting its history and provenance for scholarly journals. She also mentioned that several museums would be interested in featuring it in exhibitions about Spanish royal history or colonial jewelry. There's significant historical value beyond the monetary worth, she explained. This ring represents a direct connection to 18th century Spanish court culture, and the story of how it survived through your family is remarkable in itself. But what interested me most was her offer to create a formal presentation about the ring's history. Dr. Alvarez frequently gave lectures about historical jewelry, and she was excited about the opportunity to share this discovery with others. I could prepare a multimedia presentation, she suggested. Historical context, photographs of the ring alongside other royal pieces, family genealogy, the works. It would be suitable for academic conferences, museum events, that sort of thing. That's when my plan began to take real shape. Jessica's wedding was being held at the Heritage Club, an upscale venue that prided itself on historical elegance. The reception hall had a small stage area where the DJ set up, but it also had audio-visual equipment for presentations. What if there was a way to share Dr. Alvarez's research at the wedding itself? I spent the weekend thinking through the logistics. The wedding reception would include most of David's extended family, people who had known Elena Rodriguez and heard her stories about family secrets. They would be the perfect audience for learning the truth about the ring Jessica had dismissed so cruelly. But I needed to be strategic about how I approached this. A direct confrontation with Jessica would make me look petty and vindictive. Instead, I needed to frame the revelation as something positive, something that honored Elena's memory and celebrated the family's heritage. On Monday, I called Marcus at the bank where he worked. David's brother had always been the more diplomatic of the two, the one who tried to keep peace in the family even when Jessica was being particularly difficult. "Marcus, it's Maria," I said when he answered. "I have something I'd like to discuss with you about your grandmother, Elena." I could hear the wariness in his voice. He was probably expecting another complaint about Jessica's behavior, another family conflict he'd have to navigate. "What about Grandma Elena?" he asked carefully. "I've discovered some information about her background that I think the family would find interesting. Some historical research that reveals she had a more significant past than any of us realized." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What kind of information?" I gave him the basic outline without revealing the ring's astronomical value or royal connections. I explained about the genealogical research, about Elena's family's connection to Spanish craftsmanship and historical preservation. I framed it as an opportunity to honor their grandmother's memory by sharing her true heritage with the family. "That sounds fascinating," Marcus said, and I could hear genuine interest in his voice. "Where did all this research come from?" "I had Elena's ring appraised," I said simply. "It led to some discoveries about her family background that I think everyone should know about." I could practically hear Marcus thinking. He knew about Jessica's comments at the anniversary dinner, had seen how uncomfortable the evening became. This would be a way to address that situation indirectly while celebrating family history. "Would you be interested in sharing this information at the wedding reception?" I asked. "I know someone who could prepare a presentation about Elena's background. It could be a nice tribute to her memory." Marcus was immediately enthusiastic about the idea. "Jessica would love that," he said, which almost made me laugh out loud. "She's been worried that she came across wrong at dinner the other night. This would be a perfect way to honor the family history she was asking about." We agreed that Marcus would speak to Jessica about adding a brief presentation to the reception program. I would handle arranging the presentation itself and coordinating with the venue's technical staff. By Wednesday, everything was in place. Dr. Alvarez had agreed to present her research at the wedding reception, framing it as an academic lecture about Spanish colonial history and family preservation of artifacts. The Heritage Club's event coordinator was delighted to accommodate what she called such a unique and educational element to the reception program. Jessica, according to Marcus, was thrilled about the addition to her wedding. She saw it as sophisticated and cultured, the kind of intellectual touch that would impress her guests. She had no idea she was about to become the guest of honor, at her own humiliation. The presentation was scheduled for the time between dinner and dancing, when guests would be relaxed and receptive to learning something new. Dr. Alvarez had prepared a 20-minute multimedia presentation that would trace the ring's history from the Spanish royal court to Elena's immigration to America, ending with its current status as a documented historical artifact. I spent the days leading up to the wedding in a strange state of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Part of me worried that I was being vindictive, that public embarrassment wasn't the right response to Jessica's cruelty. But another part of me thought about Elena Rodriguez, about how she had carried royal secrets while cleaning other people's houses, and felt that the truth deserved to be told. David remained conflicted about the whole situation. He was amazed by the ring's history and proud of his grandmother's heritage, but he worried about the impact on family relationships. "Are you sure this is the right way to handle things with Jessica?" he asked the night before the wedding. "I mean, she was awful at dinner, but publicly correcting her at her own wedding seems..." "Harsh?" I suggested. "Yeah, harsh." I considered his point. It was harsh. But Jessica had chosen to make my ring's supposed worthlessness a public issue. She had humiliated me in front of family and strangers, used my jewelry as evidence of my inferior status in the family. If she hadn't made it public, I might have been content to keep Elena's secrets private. "She called it pathetic," I reminded David. "In front of everyone at the restaurant. She said it proved you didn't love me enough to invest in our relationship." David winced at the memory. "I know. And she was wrong. But Maria, are you doing this to vindicate Grandma Elena's memory? Or are you doing this to get back at Jessica?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself. The honest answer was that it was both. I wanted Elena's true story to be known, wanted the family to understand what an extraordinary woman she had been. But I also wanted Jessica to face the consequences of her cruelty, to understand just how wrong she had been. "Does it matter?" I asked finally. "If the result is the same? The family learns the truth about Elena, and Jessica learns not to judge things she doesn't understand?" David didn't have an answer for that. But when he saw me getting ready for the wedding the next morning, carefully putting on Elena's ring and the simple black dress I'd chosen for the occasion, he kissed me and said, "Grandma Elena would be proud of you." The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. Jessica looked stunning in her elaborate designer gown, and Marcus seemed genuinely happy as they exchanged vows. For a moment, watching them at the altar, I almost regretted my plan. They looked so perfect together, so confident in their future, that disrupting their special day felt unnecessarily cruel. But then, during the cocktail hour before dinner, Jessica approached me with that familiar sympathetic smile. "Maria, I'm so glad you came," she said, taking my hand in both of hers. "And I want to apologize for the other night. I think I came across wrong when I was asking about your ring. I was just curious about the family history." She was still holding my hand, still examining the ring that had caused such a scene at the restaurant. Her tone was conciliatory, but there was something performative about her apology, as if she was checking off a box on her wedding day to-do list. "It's a sweet little piece," she continued. "I'm sure it has a lot of sentimental value, and that's what really matters, right?" The condescension in her voice, the way she emphasized sentimental value while dismissing any other kind of worth, crystallized my resolve. Jessica hadn't learned anything from the anniversary dinner disaster. She was still certain that my ring was a quaint trinket, still convinced that her judgment had been correct. "You're right," I said calmly. "It does have significant value. I'm looking forward to sharing that with everyone tonight." Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "Sharing what?" "The family history presentation Marcus mentioned. About Elena's background and the significance of family heirlooms. I think everyone will find it quite educational." I could see the moment when Jessica realized she might have agreed to something she didn't fully understand. But before she could ask more questions, Marcus appeared to escort her to the head table for dinner. As I watched her walk away, my hand unconsciously went to the ring Elena had worn for decades while keeping her secrets safe. Tonight, those secrets would finally be revealed, and Jessica would learn just how catastrophically wrong her judgment had been. The irony was perfect. She had demanded to know why David hadn't invested more in our relationship, why my ring wasn't worthy of respect or admiration. Tonight, she would discover that my pathetic ring was worth more than her house, her car, and her precious diamond engagement ring combined. More than that, she would learn that Elena Rodriguez, the poor immigrant cleaning lady she had never bothered to ask about, had been the guardian of royal treasures, carrying Spanish history across an ocean and through decades of quiet dignity. I looked around the elegant reception hall, at the family members who had known Elena and the new faces who had only heard fragments of her story. Soon they would all understand what an extraordinary woman she had been, and what an extraordinary legacy she had left behind. The presentation was set to begin in 30 minutes. Dr. Alvarez was already setting up her equipment, arranging the photographs and historical documents that would tell Elena's true story. Jessica sat at the head table, radiant in her wedding gown, completely unaware that her perfect day was about to become a lesson in humility she would never forget. The moment arrived with the subtle clink of Marcus tapping his champagne glass with a silver spoon. The reception hall quieted as conversations died down and all eyes turned toward the head table where the newlyweds sat. Jessica looked radiant, her cheeks flushed with champagne and happiness, completely unaware that the next 20 minutes would fundamentally alter how everyone in the room viewed her judgment and character. "Before we move on to dancing," Marcus announced, his voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system, "we have a very special presentation tonight. My new sister-in-law Maria recently discovered some fascinating information about our grandmother Elena's heritage, and we're fortunate to have Dr. Patricia Alvarez here to share this research with all of us." Jessica's smile remained perfect, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes as she tried to remember exactly what she had agreed to. She had been focused on wedding planning details when Marcus mentioned the presentation, and I suspected she had pictured something brief and sentimental, perhaps a few family photographs and stories about Elena's immigration to America. Dr. Alvarez took the small stage with the confidence of someone who had delivered hundreds of academic lectures. She was elegant in her navy dress suit, her silver hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon that complemented the historical nature of her presentation. The audio-visual equipment hummed to life, and the first slide appeared on the large screen that had been set up beside the DJ booth. "Good evening, everyone," Dr. Alvarez began, her voice warm but authoritative. "I'm delighted to be here tonight to share some remarkable discoveries about Elena Rodriguez and her family's extraordinary connection to Spanish royal history." The first slide showed a map of Spain with Toledo highlighted, and I watched as the room's attention focused completely on the presentation. Elena's story was already capturing the audience, even the younger guests who had never met David's grandmother. Elena Rodriguez immigrated to the United States in 1943, carrying with her not just hopes for a new life, but also the responsibility of preserving artifacts that connect directly to, well, the Spanish royal court of the 18th century. Dr. Alvarez continued. Jessica's expression had shifted from polite interest to slight confusion. This wasn't the simple family history presentation she had expected. But the rest of the room was completely engaged, leaning forward in their chairs as Dr. Alvarez began weaving Elena's personal story into the broader context of Spanish colonial history. The next slide showed genealogical charts tracing Elena's maternal lineage back to the Mendoza family. Dr. Alvarez explained the role of court jewelers in Spanish royal society, how families like the Mendozas were trusted with creating and maintaining the most precious artifacts of the monarchy. The Mendoza workshop was responsible for some of the most exquisite jewelry in the Spanish royal collection. Dr. Alvarez explained, clicking to a slide showing museum photographs of elaborate necklaces, tiaras, and ceremonial pieces. But their most significant contribution may have been their role in preserving royal artifacts during the tumultuous period of the early 1800s. I could see understanding beginning to dawn on some faces in the audience. David's Aunt Carmen, who had known Elena well, was nodding thoughtfully. Several cousins were whispering to each other, making connections between family stories they had heard and the historical context Dr. Alvarez was providing. But Jessica still looked puzzled, glancing between the presentation and Marcus with an expression that suggested she was wondering where this was all leading. That's when Dr. Alvarez clicked to the slide that changed everything. "Which brings us to this particular artifact," she said, and suddenly my ring appeared on the screen in magnificent detail. The high-resolution photograph showed every delicate vine and flower, every carefully crafted detail that had been invisible to casual observation. This ring, currently worn by Maria Gonzalez, represents one of the most significant discoveries in Spanish colonial jewelry research in the past decade. The gasp from Jessica was audible even over the murmur of surprise that rippled through the room. Her hand flew to her throat, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely shocked instead of merely surprised. Dr. Alvarez was just getting started. The next slide showed the detailed photographs of the hallmarks Morrison had discovered, magnified to reveal the tiny crown symbol that indicated royal court manufacture. These hallmarks tell us that this ring was created in Toledo between 1720 and 1740. Specifically for the Spanish royal family or their immediate circle, Dr. Alvarez explained. But the story becomes even more remarkable when we examine the historical records. The slide changed to show the museum catalog page Morrison had found, with the drawing of my ring alongside the Spanish notation about Infanta Maria Teresa Rafaela. Dr. Alvarez read the translation aloud, her voice carrying a reverence that made the historical connection feel immediate and real. Commissioned 1735, for the bridal jewelry of Infanta Maria Teresa Rafaela of Spain, daughter of King Philip V, featuring her personal botanical motif in silver filigree work by the Royal Court Workshop of Miguel Mendoza. The silence in the room was complete now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, standing frozen with serving trays as they listened to Dr. Alvarez explain how a piece of 18th-century Spanish royal jewelry had ended up in a small Iowa town. I looked directly at Jessica for the first time since the presentation began. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and her champagne glass sat forgotten in her hand. She was staring at the screen, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing and hearing. The ring's journey from the Spanish royal court to Elena Rodriguez represents a fascinating example of how loyal court servants preserved royal artifacts during periods of political upheaval, Dr. Alvarez continued. When the French invaded Spain and the royal family was forced into exile, valuable pieces were distributed among trusted families for safekeeping. The next slide showed historical documents about the Peninsular War and its impact on the Spanish nobility. Dr. Alvarez explained how Elena's great-great-grandfather, Miguel Mendoza, had been entrusted with several pieces from the royal collection, including Maria Teresa Rafaela's personal jewelry. Elena Rodriguez carried this responsibility across an ocean and through decades of immigrant life in America, preserving not just a valuable artifact, but a piece of living history, Dr. Alvarez said. Her decision to pass the ring to her grandson's wife represents the continuation of a trust that has lasted nearly 3 centuries. That's when Dr. Alvarez delivered the information that I knew would devastate Jessica completely. Based on recent authentication by certified gemologists and comparison with similar pieces in the Spanish royal collection, this ring has been conservatively appraised at between $1.2 and $2.5 million. However, given its documented royal provenance and historical significance, its actual value to collectors and museums could be significantly higher. The number hung in the air like a physical presence: $1.2 to $2.5 million. For the ring that Jessica had held up in a crowded restaurant just 2 weeks ago, calling it pathetic and using it as evidence that my husband didn't love me enough to invest in our relationship. Jessica's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the table with a sharp crystal chime that seemed to echo in the stunned silence. Champagne spread across the white tablecloth, but she didn't seem to notice. She was staring at me with an expression of pure horror, as if she was finally understanding the magnitude of her mistake. Dr. Alvarez continued with details about the ring's authentication process, the academic papers that would be written about it, and the museum exhibitions that were already expressing interest in featuring it. But I was watching the faces around the room, seeing how the family's perception of Elena, of me, and especially of Jessica, was shifting in real time. David's Aunt Carmen had tears in her eyes. "Elena never said a word," she whispered to her husband. All those years she was cleaning houses and sewing dresses, and she was carrying a piece of Spanish royal history. The cousins who had always treated Elena's side of the family as the poor relations were looking stunned. Uncle Robert, who had always been condescending about Elena's old country stories, was staring at the screen as if he couldn't process what he was hearing. But it was Marcus's reaction that surprised me most. He was looking at Jessica with something I had never seen before. Disappointment. Not anger or embarrassment, but a deep disappointment that suggested he was seeing his new wife in an entirely different light. "You called it pathetic," he said quietly, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying to nearby tables. "At dinner 2 weeks ago, you held up Maria's ring and called it pathetic." Jessica turned to him, her eyes wide with panic. "Marcus, I didn't know. How could I have known? It looks like costume jewelry." Anyone would have thought. But her words trailed off as she realized how they sounded. The ring didn't look like costume jewelry to anyone who bothered to examine it closely. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the silver work intricate, and obviously handmade. She had dismissed it because she had decided it wasn't valuable, not because she had carefully evaluated its worth. Dr. Alvarez was concluding her presentation with information about the ring's future. Museums in both the United States and Spain had expressed interest in featuring it in exhibitions. Academic institutions wanted to study it further. The Spanish government had even reached out about potentially recognizing Elena's family as official guardians of royal heritage. "What makes this discovery particularly significant," Dr. Alvarez said, "is that it represents not just the preservation of a valuable artifact, but the preservation of a story." Elena Rodriguez's commitment to protecting this piece of history, even while facing the challenges of immigrant life, demonstrates the extraordinary responsibility that ordinary people sometimes carry. As the presentation ended and polite applause filled the room, I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap, the weight of the ring feeling different now that everyone knew its true nature. The secret that Elena had carried for decades was finally revealed, and the vindication felt both satisfying and overwhelming. But it was Jessica's reaction that would stay with me forever. As guests began approaching our table to examine the ring more closely, to ask questions about Elena's family and the authentication process, Jessica sat frozen in her wedding dress, her face a mask of humiliation and regret. "Maria," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize. I had no idea. The things I said about your ring, about David not investing in your relationship." She stopped, unable to continue. "You're right," I said quietly, meeting her eyes directly. You had no idea. But that didn't stop you from making judgments, did it? The question hung between us as family members crowded around, wanting to see the ring that had suddenly become the most famous piece of jewelry in Cedar Falls. Jessica's perfect wedding day had become the day she learned that appearances could be deceiving, that her certainty about other people's worth had been spectacularly wrong. As I answered questions about Elena's history and the ring's authentication, I thought about the young Spanish princess who had worn this same ring nearly 3 centuries ago. Maria Teresa Rafaela had died young, but her personal symbol had survived revolution, war, immigration, and time itself. Now it would be remembered, not just as a piece of royal jewelry, but as a testament to the extraordinary woman who had preserved it through pure determination and love. Jessica had called it pathetic. History had just proven her wrong in the most public way possible. The weeks following Jessica's wedding transformed everything in ways I never could have anticipated. Word of the ring's discovery spread beyond our family, reaching local newspapers, then regional media, and finally attracting attention from international collectors and historians. The quiet life David and I had built in Cedar Falls suddenly became very public, though in the most wonderful way possible. The immediate aftermath of the wedding reception had been both satisfying and uncomfortable. As guests lined up to examine the ring and ask questions about Elena's heritage, Jessica had quietly disappeared from her own reception, claiming she needed fresh air. Marcus found her 20 minutes later in the venue's parking lot, sitting in their honeymoon suite limousine, still in her wedding dress but looking utterly defeated. I learned about this later from Marcus himself, who called me 3 days after the wedding to apologize for his wife's behavior and to express his amazement at the discovery about their grandmother. She's been crying for days, he told me over the phone. Not because she's embarrassed, though she is, but because she realized how badly she misjudged you and how disrespectful she was to Grandma Elena's memory. I felt a mix of satisfaction and sympathy for Jessica. The humiliation had been complete and public, exactly what she deserved for her cruelty at the anniversary dinner. But hearing about her tears made me realize that my vindication had come at a real cost to her sense of self and her new marriage. She wants to make amends, Marcus continued. She's been researching Elena's history on her own, learning about Spanish immigration patterns and the challenges our grandmother faced. I think she's beginning to understand what an extraordinary woman Elena was. That conversation led to an unexpected lunch meeting with Jessica a week later. She looked different when she walked into the small cafe where we'd agreed to meet, less polished somehow, more uncertain. Gone was the confident woman who had grabbed my hand in front of a restaurant full of people to criticize my ring. In her place was someone who seemed genuinely humbled by her spectacular error in judgment. I don't expect you to forgive me, Jessica said immediately, before I could even order coffee. What I did at your anniversary dinner was cruel and thoughtless, and I have no excuse for it. She had prepared what amounted to a formal apology, acknowledging not just her comments about the ring, but her broader pattern of condescension toward me since joining the family. She recognized that she had made assumptions about my worth based on superficial markers of success, and she understood now how wrong those assumptions had been. I spent so much time focused on external things, she said, twisting her own engagement ring around her finger. My job, my car, my jewelry. I thought those things defined value, defined love. I never considered that real value might be hidden, might require looking deeper. Her apology was sincere, but what struck me most was her genuine curiosity about Elena's story. Jessica had spent the days since the wedding researching Spanish history, learning about the challenges faced by immigrants in the 1940s, and developing a real appreciation for what Elena had accomplished. She preserved a piece of royal history while building an entirely new life in a foreign country, Jessica said with something approaching awe. The strength that must have taken, the responsibility she carried every day. I can't imagine having that kind of courage. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Jessica and I began to develop what could only be described as a friendship. Not the close, intimate kind that develops between kindred spirits, but the respectful kind that grows between people who have learned important lessons about each other. She became genuinely interested in Elena's story and helped research additional family history that filled in gaps in our understanding of how the ring had traveled from Spain to Iowa. Her professional skills in pharmaceutical sales, it turned out, translated well to genealogical research, and she had a talent for tracking down historical documents and making connections that had eluded the rest of us. Meanwhile, David's reaction to the ring's revelation had been transformative in its own way. Learning that his grandmother had been the guardian of royal Spanish heritage gave him a new perspective on his own identity and potential. The student loans that had seemed insurmountable suddenly became manageable. The modest life we had accepted as our permanent situation suddenly had other possibilities. But more than the financial implications, David seemed to inherit some of Elena's quiet strength. He began taking more pride in his heritage, asking questions about family history that he had never bothered to explore before. He started learning Spanish, saying he wanted to understand the culture that had shaped his grandmother's early life. The ring itself became something of a local celebrity. The Cedar Falls Community College, where I worked, asked me to speak about Elena's story at several events. The local historical society wanted to feature the ring in an exhibition about immigration and cultural preservation. Even the Iowa State Historical Museum expressed interest in borrowing it for a larger exhibition about Midwestern immigrant families. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 6 months after Jessica's wedding, I received a letter from the Spanish Embassy in Washington, D.C. The Spanish government had learned about the ring through Dr. Alvarez's academic publications and wanted to formally recognize Elena's family as guardians of Spanish cultural heritage. The letter, written on official embassy letterhead, explained that families who had preserved royal artifacts through periods of political upheaval were considered important cultural allies by the modern Spanish government. Elena's commitment to protecting Maria Teresa Rafaela's ring for nearly 8 decades qualified her descendants for special recognition. David and I were invited to Madrid as guests of the Spanish government for a ceremony honoring families who had preserved royal artifacts. The trip would include meetings with historians, visits to museums where other pieces from the same royal collection were housed, and the opportunity to see the places where Elena had lived before immigrating to America. Standing in our small apartment, holding that official invitation, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. It had started with Jessica's cruelty, with her public dismissal of my ring as evidence of my inferior worth. But that cruelty had led to curiosity, which had led to discovery, which had led to recognition of something extraordinary that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. The financial value of the ring, while staggering, had become almost secondary to its historical and personal significance. David and I had decided not to sell it, at least not immediately. Instead, we were exploring options that would allow us to maintain ownership while sharing its historical importance with others. Several museums had proposed long-term loan arrangements that would provide us with significant annual payments while keeping the ring in public view. The Spanish government had suggested a rotating exhibition program that would allow the ring to be displayed in both Spanish and American museums, telling the story of cultural preservation across continents and centuries. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the change in how our family viewed Elena's legacy. The woman who had been remembered as a hardworking immigrant who built a better life through determination was now understood as something much more extraordinary. She had been a guardian of history, carrying royal secrets while scrubbing floors and sewing wedding dresses, protecting artifacts worth millions while living paycheck to paycheck. The anniversary dinner where Jessica had humiliated me now seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a year. The restaurant where she had held up my hand and called my ring pathetic had since asked if they could display a photograph of the ring with information about its history, turning the sight of my humiliation into a celebration of Elena's story. Jessica herself had become one of the most vocal advocates for Elena's recognition. She had written letters to historical societies, researched additional family connections, and even proposed establishing a scholarship fund in Elena's name for first-generation college students studying Spanish history or cultural preservation. Her transformation wasn't just about making amends for her earlier cruelty, though that was certainly part of it. She had genuinely come to understand that value could be hidden, that worth wasn't always visible on the surface, and that making assumptions about people based on material possessions was both foolish and dangerous. The last time I saw Jessica, at Marcus's birthday party 6 months after her wedding, she approached me with a small wrapped package. "I wanted you to have this," she said, handing me the gift. Inside was a silver bracelet with a charm in the shape of a tiny crown. "It's not valuable," she said quickly. "I mean, not monetarily, but I had it made to match the royal symbol on your ring. I thought you might like having something that connects to Elena's story that you could wear every day." It was a thoughtful gift, one that showed she truly understood the difference between sentimental value and monetary worth. More importantly, it represented her acknowledgement that some of the most precious things in life are those that carry meaning beyond their material composition. As I write this, Elena's ring sits in a velvet-lined case in our bedroom safe, waiting for its next public appearance. Next month, David and I will travel to Madrid for the Spanish government ceremony, where we will meet other families who preserved royal artifacts through centuries of upheaval and change. The ring will be photographed alongside other pieces from Maria Teresa Rafaela's collection, reuniting elements of an 18th-century Spanish princess's jewelry for the first time since her death nearly 300 years ago. Spanish historians will document its preservation story, adding Elena's name to the official records of cultural guardians maintained by the royal collection. But when we return to Cedar Falls, the ring will come home with us. It belongs here, in this small Iowa town where Elena built her American life, where she raised her family while keeping royal secrets safe. It belongs with the people who understand that its value lies not just in its monetary worth or historical significance, but in the story of the extraordinary woman who protected it through pure love and determination. Jessica learned that worth cannot be measured by appearances, that value is often hidden beneath humble surfaces, and that making judgments without understanding can lead to spectacular humiliation. But more than that, she learned that real worth comes from character, from the choices we make about how we treat others and how we honor the legacies entrusted to us. Elena Rodriguez spent decades protecting a piece of Spanish royal history while building an American dream from nothing. Her great-granddaughter-in-law learned to see beyond surface appearances to recognize true value. And a piece of jewelry that was once called pathetic revealed itself to be priceless in every sense of the word. The ring that Jessica mocked as evidence of my unworthiness became proof that the most extraordinary treasures are often hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets to those wise enough to look beyond the surface. Sometimes justice comes not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet revelation of truth. Sometimes the sweetest vindication is simply allowing facts to speak for themselves. And sometimes the most pathetic thing is not a humble ring worn with love, but the arrogance of those who mistake appearance for reality. Elena's ring taught us all that lesson, and in doing so, honored the memory of both a Spanish princess who died too young and an immigrant grandmother who carried royal secrets across an ocean and through a lifetime of quiet dignity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.